In 39 years on the bench, I have seen almost everything a courtroom can show a person. I have seen grown men cry over parking tickets because it wasn't really about the ticket. I have seen teenagers stand taller than their own fear the moment someone finally listened to them. I have seen fear, I have seen regret, I have seen confusion, and I have seen defiance walk through those doors like it owned the place. But there is one case that has stayed with me longer than most, not because the charge was unusual, and not because anything violent happened, but because of how quickly arrogance can turn into humility once reality finally catches up with a person. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I'll be sharing more stories like this one, straight from 39 years of watching human nature play out in real time under oath in front of a judge who has heard just about every excuse there is. This case wasn't really about a traffic violation. On paper, that's what it was. But underneath the paperwork, it was about respect. Respect for the people who serve the public every single day without ever getting their names in the file. Respect for a system that only works because people believe in it enough to follow it. And let me tell you, the moment I heard what this young man said to my court clerk before he ever stepped foot in my courtroom, I knew I had a lesson to teach, not just to him, to everyone watching, whether they were sitting in my gallery that morning or whether they're watching this story unfold right now, wherever you are. When this case landed on my desk, it looked routine. I want to be honest with you about that, because I don't want to pretend every file that crosses my bench comes with some dramatic red flag attached to it. Most of them don't. This one, at first glance, was a moving violation. Reckless driving, excessive speed, failure to obey a traffic signal. That's Tuesday morning in a busy municipal court. I could probably recite the statute numbers in my sleep after 39 years of reading them. The defendant was a young man, mid-20s, clean record up until that point. No prior criminal history, no prior traffic history that raised any eyebrows. On paper, he looked like exactly what he probably was, someone who made a mistake behind the wheel. I want you to understand something about how I approach every file before I ever see a face attached to it. I don't walk into that courtroom looking for reasons to be harsh. I walk in looking for the truth of a person's situation. And more often than not, that truth is simple. People rush, people get distracted, people misjudge a yellow light. It happens. But as I reviewed this file more closely, something caught my attention, and it wasn't in the police report. It was a handwritten note clipped to the front of the file from my court clerk. Now, I want to take a moment here, because I think this part matters more than people realize. I have worked with clerks for nearly 4 decades. I have watched them process thousands of cases a year, answer the same questions over and over again from people who are stressed, scared, confused, sometimes rude, without even meaning to be. These are professionals. They are patient in ways that would test most people's limits. It takes a great deal for one of them to sit down and write out a formal note about an interaction with someone at the counter. In my experience, that only happens when something crossed a line that even a seasoned clerk, someone who has heard every complaint in the book, couldn't just let go. I remember picking up that note, leaning back in my chair and reading it twice before I set it down. And I remember thinking, this isn't just about driving anymore, because in my courtroom, and I've said this for 39 years, how you treat people matters just as much as what you're charged with. Sometimes it matters more. And I had a feeling, even before I met him, that this young man was about to learn that the hard way. Let me tell you what happened that day at the clerk's window, as I later understood it from the written statement and from speaking with my staff afterward. It was a busy morning at the courthouse. If you've ever been to a municipal courthouse on a weekday morning, you know what that looks like. People lined up out the door before it even opens. Parents holding paperwork in one hand and a coffee in the other. People trying to figure out which window handles what. It's chaotic in the way that only bureaucracy can be chaotic. And my clerks are the ones standing at the front of that chaos every single day, trying to bring order to it, one person at a time. This young man walked up to the counter already frustrated. According to the clerk, he didn't greet her. He didn't wait for her to finish typing before he started talking. He launched right into it. "I've been standing here too long," he said. "This whole system is a joke." Now, I want to pause here and say something, because I think it's important. I understand frustration. People come to court stressed. Nobody wakes up excited to deal with a traffic citation. There is stress money on the line. There's the worry about points on a license. There's the simple indignity of having to take time off work to stand in a line and explain yourself to a stranger behind a counter. I understand all of that. But there is a way to express frustration, and there is a way that crosses a line, and what happened next crossed that line. The clerk, doing exactly what she is trained to do, calmly tried to explain his case status. She told him his hearing date. She told him what to expect. She told him what documents he might need to bring. She was doing her job, and by every account I have, she was doing it well, with patience, with professionalism, the same way she does it for hundreds of people every single week. And that's when things escalated. He leaned forward, according to her statement, and said something that frankly disappointed me deeply when I first read it. "You people sit here all day doing nothing," he told her. "You're basically useless." I remember reading that line and just pausing, sitting there in my chambers with the file open in front of me and just pausing, because I've worked with these clerks for decades. I have watched them stay late to help someone who came in 5 minutes before closing in a panic. I have watched them explain the same process for the 10th time in a day without ever raising their voice. They are, in every sense of the word, the backbone of this court. They treat people with dignity even when they are not treated the same way in return. Day after day, year after year, mostly without a single word of thanks. And here was someone, a young man with no prior record, no history of hardship that I could see in the file, choosing to tear down a person who was simply trying to help him. But it didn't stop there. According to her statement, he laughed, actually laughed, and added, "I don't even know why you're here. Anyone could do your job better." When I read that line, I shook my head. I want to be clear about something. It wasn't out of anger. After 39 years, very little makes me angry anymore in the way it might have when I was younger on this bench. What I felt was disappointment, because I have been doing this long enough to know that when someone shows that kind of disrespect in a small, seemingly unimportant moment, in a moment where they think no one who matters is watching, it often reflects something deeper about how they move through the world. And I knew that when he stepped into my courtroom, I was going to have to address more than just a traffic violation. If you're finding this story worth your time, do me a favor and subscribe. I've got 39 years of these stories, and I'm only getting started with this one. As I continued reviewing the evidence in the file, I saw that the driving violation itself was clear-cut. The police report indicated he was traveling well above the posted speed limit, and that he had run a red light at an intersection that, from the description in the report, sees a fair amount of pedestrian and cross traffic during the morning commute. There were no injuries, thank goodness for that. But the risk he created that morning was significant, and I want to be honest with you. Risk matters to me, even when the worst outcome doesn't happen. A close call is still a warning shot. The officer's statement attached to the file was straightforward and professional. No exaggeration, no embellishment, just the facts as they were observed. That officer, by the way, has been on the force for over a decade. And I have read enough of his reports over the years to know he doesn't pad them. When he says a violation was clear, I believe him. But what stood out to me most, more than the violation itself, was the pattern of behavior I was starting to see laid out in front of me. Here was someone who had ignored traffic laws designed to keep people safe, and then walked into the very courthouse meant to help him navigate the consequences of that, and disrespected the person trying to do exactly that. I had to ask myself a question I ask myself with almost every case that crosses my desk. What lesson does this person need right now? Because my responsibility as a judge was never just to impose fines and move on to the next file. If it were only that, we wouldn't need a judge at all. We'd need a calculator. My responsibility is to guide people, to help them understand in a way that actually lands the impact of their actions, both on the road and off it. And in this case, the disrespect toward my clerk weighed heavily on my mind. Not because it offended me personally. I have thicker skin than that after 39 years. It weighed on me because it revealed a lack of appreciation for other people, for the quiet, unglamorous work that keeps a system like ours functioning. And that is something I take very seriously every single time it walks into my courtroom. By the time this case actually came before me, word of the interaction at the clerk's window had already spread quietly among the courthouse staff. People were talking about it, not because it was shocking. In a courthouse, you see far more shocking things on a weekly basis, but because it was so unnecessary. There was no reason for it, no provocation beyond a line that wasn't moving fast enough for his liking. Now, I've had cases go viral over the years. I've had clips of my courtroom shared far and wide, watched by more people than I could ever imagine standing in front of. People share these moments online now, and suddenly a case that might have been seen by 8 people in the gallery is seen by 8 million people on a screen somewhere. And I'll tell you something I believe with my whole heart. Whether 8 people are watching or 8 million are watching, it does not change how I do my job, not one bit. In my courtroom, every single person who stands before me gets the same fair process. I don't perform for a camera. I don't seek attention for myself. I focus entirely on the person standing in front of me and on what justice actually requires in that specific moment for that specific person. And in this case, I knew the real work was going to begin the moment that young man walked through my courtroom doors. When he finally did walk in, I observed him carefully, the way I observe everyone who comes before me. It's a habit built over 39 years. You learn to read a room and you learn to read a person before they've said a single word. He was well-dressed, confident, maybe a little too confident for someone standing in front of a judge on a morning where the file in front of her included a note about how he treated her staff. He approached the podium, and I could see it immediately. The same attitude I had read about in that handwritten note from my clerk. It was in the way he carried himself, the way his eyes moved around the courtroom, like he was slightly above being there. I looked at him and said calmly, "Good morning, sir." He nodded slightly. Morning. No warmth in it. No real acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum required to be polite. I glanced down at the file, then back up at him. "Sir, you're here today for a traffic violation, speeding and running a red light. Is that correct?" "Yeah," he said casually, "but honestly, it's being blown out of proportion." I paused. I let the silence sit there for a moment, because silence in a courtroom does more work than people realize. "I've been doing this a long time," I said, "and I've learned that when someone tells me something is nothing, it's usually something worth looking at more closely." He shrugged. "I mean, everyone speeds." I leaned forward slightly. "Not everyone runs red lights," I said. There was a brief silence. I could feel the gallery watching, the way people always do when they sense a moment shifting. Then I continued, "But before we go any further, there's something else I need to address." I picked up the note from my clerk, holding it so he could see there was, in fact, something in writing about this. "Sir, I received a report about your interaction with one of my court clerks. Do you recall speaking with her?" He shifted his weight slightly, the confidence dimming just a fraction. Yeah, I talked to someone. I'm told I said carefully, choosing every word, that you referred to her as useless and said that anyone could do her job better. He smirked. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. He actually smirked. I mean, I was frustrated, he said. It's not a big deal. I took a breath before I responded because I wanted my words to land the way they needed to. Let me tell you something, I said, my voice steady, not raised, just steady. It is a big deal. The courtroom grew quiet in that particular way it does when everyone in the room realizes the conversation just shifted into something more serious. These clerks work hard every single day, I continued. They help people understand a process that most folks find confusing and stressful. They treat everyone who walks up to that counter with respect, whether that person deserves it in the moment or not, and they keep this entire system functioning. Without them, none of us in this building could do our jobs. He looked away toward the wall, toward anywhere but me. I went on. And when you stand there and insult someone who is doing their job simply because you're frustrated with a line, that tells me something about your character. Not everything, but something. He sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from someone who thinks they're being lectured unfairly. I said I was frustrated. I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that I'd heard him. I understand frustration, I said. I've felt frustration plenty of times myself, believe me. But frustration does not give you the right to disrespect another human being who is simply trying to help you. I paused, letting that sink in before I added, in my courtroom, and honestly, in life, respect is not optional. I could see something shift in his posture. The confidence wasn't gone entirely, but it was shaken the way a building sways in an earthquake without actually falling. I turned back to the case itself. Now, regarding your driving, I said, the report shows you were traveling significantly above the posted speed limit and that you ran a red light at an intersection with regular pedestrian traffic. Do you dispute any of that? He hesitated. I mean, I was in a hurry. I looked at him directly. In a hurry to do what? He didn't answer. The silence stretched out long enough that it answered for him. I shook my head gently, not with anger, but with the tired familiarity of someone who has heard this exact silence many times before. Sir, I have seen too many cases in this courtroom where someone was in a hurry and someone else paid the price for it. I let the room sit with that for a moment. You are fortunate that no one was hurt this time. I paused again before continuing. But that doesn't make it acceptable. I've been on this bench long enough to know that punishment alone doesn't change people. Understanding does. I looked at him and said, Sir, I want you to understand something. I have been a judge for 39 years. I have seen thousands of people come through this courtroom. Some make mistakes and learn from them. Some don't. Some never come back. Some, unfortunately, I see again and again. I paused, letting him wait for what came next. But what concerns me about you, I continued, isn't just the driving, it's the attitude that came with it. He looked down at the podium in front of him. You disrespected someone who was trying to help you, I continued, and then you walked into my courtroom and minimized what you did, as if it was nothing worth discussing. I leaned forward slightly. That is not how responsible adults behave, and you are, by every measure, in this file, an adult. Then I said, clearly, so there could be no confusion about it. Here's what I'm going to do. I am imposing a fine for the traffic violation. That part is standard, and you should expect that regardless of anything else we've discussed today. I paused, but I am also ordering you to do something else. He looked up, genuinely surprised, like he thought the fine was the whole conversation. I want you to write a letter of apology to that clerk. He blinked. A letter? Yes, I said. A sincere one, not 2 sentences scribbled on a piece of paper to check a box. I want you to actually think about what you said to her and why it was wrong, and I want that reflected in what you write. I continued, because respect is not something you turn on and off, depending on how your morning is going. It is something you carry with you into every interaction you have with everyone, whether they're a judge, a clerk, a stranger on the street, or your own family. I paused again, and I want you to understand this clearly. Your actions have consequences, not just out on the road, where a moment's impatience could have hurt someone, but in how you treat people. Both of those things matter. Both of those things are part of who you are becoming. After I delivered the sentence, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, and I noticed something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not defiant anymore, not dismissive, just quieter. And I want to tell you something I've learned over 39 years. Sometimes that quiet is exactly the moment I'm looking for. Not fear, understanding. If this kind of story resonates with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are a lot more where this came from. After the session that day, my clerk told me that he did, in fact, submit the letter. And she said something to me afterward that has stayed with me ever since. She said it felt genuine, not performative, not written just to satisfy a court order, but genuine. That told me something had changed in him, even if it was just a little, even if it was just a crack of light getting through where there had only been arrogance before. And honestly, that's why I still do this work after 39 years. Not for the punishment itself, but for moments like that. Moments when someone begins to see things a little differently than they did when they walked in. I think about that case more than you might expect for something that, on its surface, was just a traffic ticket. And I want to share some of what I've come to believe over the years, because I think it applies far beyond that one courtroom, far beyond that one young man. Respect matters, not just in the big dramatic moments that end up in a courtroom, but in the small, quiet ones that nobody else is watching. The way you speak to a clerk behind a counter, the way you treat a stranger who is simply doing their job, the way you carry yourself when you think no one who matters is paying attention. I have found, after 39 years of watching people, that those small moments tell you more about a person's character than almost anything else could. Social media, and I say this having seen plenty of it myself over the years, often rewards arrogance. It rewards quick, sharp reactions, the kind of confidence that looks good in a 10-second clip. But real life does not work that way, and it never has. In the real world, your actions define you, slowly, over time, one interaction at a time, whether anyone is filming it or not. I've sat on this bench and watched people from every walk of life stand in front of me. Wealthy people, people with nothing, people with advanced degrees, people who never finished school, people who were polite from the moment they walked in, and people who needed a moment like the one I just described to you before they understood what was actually being asked of them. And here is what I have learned, and what I still believe after all these years. In my courtroom, I do not care who you are or where you come from. What matters, what has always mattered, is how you treat the people around you. Because at the end of the day, justice isn't only about laws written down in a book somewhere. It's about humanity. It's about how we choose to treat one another when it would be so much easier not to bother. I think back on that clerk sometimes, the one who wrote that note and quietly went back to work the same afternoon, helping the next person in line with the same patience she'd shown the one before him. Nobody wrote an article about her. Nobody put her name in a headline, but she did her job with dignity. And in the end, that mattered more in that courtroom than anything the young man in front of me said or didn't say. I think that's true more often than we give it credit for. The people who quietly do their jobs well, day after day, without asking for recognition, they are the ones holding these systems together. And when someone comes along and treats that kind of quiet dedication as if it means nothing, I believe it is part of my responsibility as someone who has been entrusted with this bench for 39 years to say something about it. Not out of vanity, not to make an example of anyone for the sake of it, but because if we don't stand up for the people who make these systems work, who will? I want to tell you something else about that morning, something I didn't mention earlier. After the young man left my courtroom that day, I asked to speak with my clerk privately, just for a few minutes. I wanted her to know that what happened at that counter was not something she should carry with her, that it said far more about him than it ever would about her. She thanked me, but I could tell she'd already moved past it in her own mind. That's the kind of resilience these people build over years of standing behind that counter. It's not that the words don't sting in the moment, it's that they've learned not to let strangers define their worth. I have always admired that about the people who work in this building. I don't think they get told often enough how much that resilience matters. There's something else I want to share with you, something that took me years on this bench to fully understand. Punishment, in the traditional sense, a fine, points on a license, a mark on a record, rarely changes how someone sees the world. It might change their behavior temporarily out of fear of consequence, but it doesn't often change their heart. What changes a person, in my experience, is being asked to genuinely reflect, to sit with what they did, to put it into their own words, to explain it, not to a judge, not to a clerk, but to themselves. That's why I asked that young man to write a letter instead of simply doubling his fine or adding an extra court date to his file. I wanted him to have to think through what he had actually said to another person and why it mattered. Sometimes that's a harder assignment than any fine could ever be. I've had defendants over the years try to write those letters as quickly as possible, just to get it over with, just to check the box and move on with their lives. You can tell almost immediately when a letter like that lands on my desk or gets passed along by a clerk. There's a hollowness to it, a sense that the person wrote what they thought I wanted to hear rather than what they actually felt. But every so often, and this was one of those times, the letter comes back different. It comes back with an honesty in it that surprises even me after all these years. My clerk told me that when she read his letter, she could tell he had actually sat with it. He didn't just apologize for the words themselves. He tried to explain what he now understood about the effect those words had, about the fact that she was a person with a life outside that counter, with her own stresses and her own long days, and that his frustration that morning had nothing to do with her personally, yet he had aimed it at her anyway. That's the kind of understanding I hope for every time I hand down a sentence like that. Not always successfully, I'll be honest with you. Not every letter comes back that way. Some people never quite get there, not on my watch anyway. But when it does happen, when someone genuinely reflects and comes out the other side with a little more humility than they walked in with, that's the entire reason I still show up to this courtroom morning after morning, year after year, decade after decade. I sometimes get asked, especially by younger attorneys or new clerks just starting out, whether it gets tiring after 39 years, seeing the same patterns of behavior over and over. And I tell them honestly, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that certain attitudes repeat themselves. Impatience, entitlement, a belief that rules exist for other people, not for the person standing in front of me. I've heard some version of it's not a big deal more times than I could ever count. But no, in the sense that every single person who walks through those doors is still a full human being with their own story, their own pressures, their own reasons for having a bad morning, even if those reasons don't excuse how they treated someone else. I try never to let the repetition of certain behaviors make me numb to the individual in front of me. That's a discipline you have to practice every single day on this job, or you risk becoming exactly the kind of person who treats people like they're interchangeable, which is precisely what I was trying to teach that young man not to do. I want to circle back to something I said earlier about how cases like this one sometimes end up being shared far beyond the walls of my courtroom. I know some of you watching this are here because a version of this story crossed your screen somewhere. A clip, a summary, a retelling, like the one I'm giving you now. And I want to say something directly to you. If you're the kind of person who works a counter somewhere, who answers phones, who stands behind a register, who does the quiet, often thankless work that keeps things running, I hope stories like this remind you that your work matters more than the people who dismiss it will ever admit out loud. And if you're the kind of person who has, in a moment of frustration, said something to someone that you later regretted, I hope this story is a gentle reminder rather than a harsh one. We all have bad mornings. What matters is what we do afterward, whether we're willing to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong and actually grow from it, the way that young man eventually did. Before I close this story out, I want to say one more thing about the nature of respect in a courtroom, because I think it's the thread that ties this entire case together. A courtroom is in many ways a small model of society itself. You have people with authority, people seeking help, people who are frustrated, people who are patient, people who are trying their best under difficult circumstances, and occasionally people who forget that everyone else in the room is human too. My job, as I have understood it for 39 years, is not only to apply the law fairly, though that is certainly the foundation of everything I do. My job is also to notice these smaller moments, the ones that don't show up neatly in a police report or a statute number, and to treat them with the same seriousness I would treat any other part of a case. Because I believe, and I have believed this for a long time, that how we treat the people with the least power to affect our lives says more about our character than how we treat the people who hold power over us. That young man learned that lesson in my courtroom on a Tuesday morning that started out looking like nothing more than a routine traffic case. He walked in with a fine waiting for him and walked out with something else too, something a fine alone could never have taught him. I don't know everything that happened in his life after that day. I never do, not with any of the people who passed through here. But I do know that for one morning, in one small courtroom, he had to sit with the discomfort of being told, clearly and without apology, that the way he treated another person mattered. And I have to believe that matters, even if I never see the full outcome of it. 39 years in, and I still believe that. I believed it on my very first day on this bench, nervous and unsure whether I had any business being called Your Honor, and I believe it just as strongly now. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about humanity, about the quiet dignity we owe each other, whether we're standing in a courtroom, a checkout line, or behind a counter on a busy Tuesday morning. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's that. Treat people well, especially the people who have no power over you and no way to make you do it. That, more than almost anything else I've seen cross this bench, tells the truth about who a person really is. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with this story with me. If it meant something to you, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one, because after 39 years, believe me, there are plenty more stories left to tell.